Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming today. We are going to get started here in a second. Let me get my screen up. All right. And today we're going to be talking about the Lincoln family and the Lincoln family album specifically. We're going to start with a little back history of Abraham Lincoln, focusing on the Lincoln's four sons. That's Robert, Eddie, Willie, and Tad. And there are over 600 photographs within the family album, starting from Mary Lincoln and going all the way down to the last generation of Lincolns. And we are so lucky to have that here in the Lincoln Financial Foundation collection here at the Allen County Public Library in the Rolland Center. So let's go ahead and get started real quick. I'll just turn off my video so you can see. A little bit first about us. So the Lincoln Museum in Fort Wayne closed in June of 2008. It had been the largest Lincoln collection in private hands up until that time and was owned by the Lincoln National Corporation. Ultimately, the museum collection, renamed the Lincoln Financial Foundation Collection, was deeded to the state of Indiana in 2009, and it is now housed in two places. The three-dimensional items are at the Indiana State Museum, and the research collection of paper items is here at the Allen County Public Library. The Rolland Center for Lincoln Research opened in Allen County Public Library in January of 2022, with the mission to connect people to the life and times of Abraham Lincoln, display and bring to life this incomparable collection of Lincoln materials, deliver a 21st century engaging experience, and make the center a destination for people inside and outside of our community. It was made possible by the vision of Ian Rolland, who was the CEO and later chairman of the board of the Lincoln National Corporation. With the Rolland Center, the collection is now fully and finally equipped with the proper exhibit cases and security to be able to display the real artifacts for the public long term. We are also equipped with a small table case that gives us an opportunity to put out temporary exhibits. We've done small cases on Juneteenth, Women's History Month, Lincoln and Indiana, and Civil War era photography, just to name a few. We also do lots of tours, so if you're local or in town, reach out about a week in advance or explore the space at your own leisure. But let's go ahead and get started on what we're all here for. First, we're going to go ahead and mention Abraham Lincoln's parents. We can trace Lincoln's ancestry from his English forebears to his parents, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, who were married on June 12, 1806 in Washington County, Kentucky. Note that the image in the center and the image of Nancy are an artist's rendition of what the cabin Thomas and Nancy were married in would have looked like and what Nancy herself would have looked like, since there are no photographs of Nancy. Their son, Abraham, was born in a one-room log cabin while still in Kentucky. The family, Thomas, Nancy, their daughter Sarah, and Abraham would move to Indiana in 1816. Of the four, only Thomas and Abraham would move from Indiana to Illinois in 1830. Nancy would pass away in 1818 at the age of 34 to milk sickness. To get milk sickness, one would have to drink the milk of a cow that had eaten a white snake root plant, which poisoned the milk. Abraham was only 9 years old when this happened. This was not the only loss he would face in his Indiana years. In 1828, at the age of 21, Abraham's older sister Sarah passed away during childbirth. After almost a year and a half of marriage to Aaron Grigsby, the couple was expected to welcome their first child. However, due to complications during delivery, both mother and infant were lost. Abraham was 18 years old. Not all was sad during Abraham's time in Indiana. A year after losing Nancy, Thomas Lincoln went back to Kentucky to find another wife and mother for his two children. He married Sarah Buss Johnston and brought her and her three children back with him to Indiana. Abraham developed a close relationship with his new stepmother, who encouraged his thirst for knowledge, and throughout his life, he referred to her as mother. In 1837, Abraham Lincoln moved to Springfield, Illinois to pursue his political aspirations and become a lawyer. While living in Springfield, he met Mary Todd. Mary was born on December 13, 1818 in Lexington, Kentucky, where she would spend her formative years. She was born into a prominent family and received more education than many women of her time. At a young age, she declared herself a Whig, one of the top political parties of the time, and the party to which Abraham Lincoln belonged. She had recently transplanted to Springfield to live with her sister, Elizabeth Todd Edwards, when she met Lincoln. Abraham and Mary had a tumultuous relationship, with one broken engagement in 1841. Mary's family, including her sister, were not very accepting of the relationship. Elizabeth later recalled how she warned Mary that they were not suitable because they came from different backgrounds. However, the couple did end up back together, and Elizabeth relented, allowing the couple to marry in her home on November 4th, 1842. Abraham and Mary had their first child, Robert, 9 months after their marriage on August 1st, 1843, while living in the Globe Tavern, a local hotel. In 1844, the Lincolns purchased their first home. They bought the home off of the same reverend that married them. This is the only house that Abraham would buy. In the Springfield house is where their other three sons, Edward, William, and Thomas, were later born. Friends and relatives recollected that Abraham and Mary were indulgent parents. For many of his Springfield years, Lincoln was a traveling lawyer. He was absent for half of the year, leaving Mary home alone with their children, and perhaps this is why Robert and Abraham had a more distant relationship than that of Abraham with his youngest sons, who had a closer relationship to their father while living in the White House. Robert Todd Lincoln, who parents called Bob, was the only Lincoln child to survive into adulthood. He took after his mother and the Todd side of the family, having more refined tastes and manner, a stark contrast to his frontier father, who grew up impoverished. He spent more time with the Todds in Kentucky than any of the younger Lincoln boys, especially while his father was serving in Congress at the end of the 1840s. Lincoln, conscious of his own limited education, emphasized the importance of education for Robert, who went to school at Phyllis Exeter Academy in New Hampshire before attending college at Harvard University from 1860 to 1864. So he did not accompany the rest of his family in the move to the White House in 1861. During the war, he begged his parents to allow him to join the army. However, his parents insisted he finish school first. He was forbidden to enlist until early in 1865, when he was appointed to General Grant's staff and was present at the Appomattox Courthouse meeting between General Grant and General Lee that was the beginning of the end of the Civil War. When his father died, Robert, then 21, took on the responsibility of caring for his grieving mother. In a letter written on behalf of Mary to Madame Bergman's prior to Abraham's funeral, Robert expressed thanks for her offer to keep his mother company, but declined on account of Bergman's health. After the end of the war and his father's assassination, Robert moved to Chicago with his mother and brother. Within a few years, he was admitted to the bar, and by 1886, he was a partner in the law practice of Isham, Lincoln, and Beale. Robert and Mary Harlan, the daughter of Senator James Harlan of Iowa, would marry in 1868. The couple had three children: Mamie, or Mary Lincoln, Jack, or Abraham II Lincoln, and Jesse Lincoln. Jack is the only child that would not live to adulthood, and he died of a blood infection at the age of 16. In this letter to an unnamed Dear Sir, Robert thanked his correspondent for offering sympathy after Jack's death. Robert's daughters would go on to have families of their own. Mamie would marry Charles Isham and have one son, Lincoln Isham. Jessie would elope, against her family's wishes, with Warren Beckwith, and they would have Peggy and Bob Beckwith, the last generation of Lincolns. Peggy loved to fly airplanes, and both her and her brother liked to drive fast cars. She and Bob even donated some items to the Lincoln Financial Foundation collection. Lincoln married once and became a stepfather, never having any other children. Peggy herself never married, and her brother Bob, like their mother Jessie, married 3 times, but had no children of his own. Sadly, he passed away in 1985, and there are no more direct descendants of Mary and Abraham. As an adult, the eldest son, Robert, had a difficult relationship with his mother. In 1875, he noticed that Mary was behaving erratically, having more dramatic mood swings and hallucinations, and was witnessed hearing voices, so he decided to seek professional help for her. To do that, he took her to trial and had her declared insane and committed to a sanitarium. At this point in Mary's life, she had dealt with a lot of loss: the loss of her parents, some of her brothers, 3 of her sons, and her husband. Mary, throughout her life, also dealt with difficult migraines that became worse after a carriage accident in 1863. These things, coupled with others, had the potential to affect Mary's mental health. In May of 1875, Robert and his lawyer, Leonard Swett, collected all of their evidence, had the judge get around a jury that was made up mostly of prominent men of the community, and took Mary to trial. She was given a lawyer, a man chosen by Robert's lawyer. Some of the central evidence given was expert testimony by a group of doctors who never personally examined Mary except for her gynecologist, who was there to make testimony that she was insane. No witnesses were called in Mary's favor, and Mary wasn't given the chance to defend herself on the stand. It only took the jury 10 minutes to declare her insane. The following day, she was transported to a sanitarium. Mary was hospitalized for not quite 4 months before she was permitted to live with her sister, Elizabeth Edwards, in Springfield, Illinois. It would be another 9 months before Mary was declared sane. The entire episode of her trial, subsequent time in the sanitarium, and the long wait to be declared sane deeply strained the relationship between Mary and her son. This is a transcript of her treatment from the New York Tribune article. In part, it reads, Mrs. Lincoln, with her attendant, occupies 2 very pleasant rooms in the part of the house reserved for the private residence of the doctor and his family. She drives and walks out when and where she pleases, but is always accompanied by her attendant. Nothing whatever has occurred to render necessary anything more than a prudent supervision, and this is given by pleasant companionship without any appearance of restraint. At present, her derangement exhibits itself mainly in a general mental feebleness and incapacity. The Lincoln Financial Foundation collection has a treasure trove of documents from Mary's time in the asylum, including court documents, telegrams, and letters. Robert maintained his political connections in Washington and served as Secretary of War from 1881 to 1885. President Garfield was assassinated in 1881, and Robert continued to serve under President Arthur. Asked several times to run for president, Robert always refused. In August of 1883, he accompanied Arthur on a 3-week expedition of Wyoming, led by Philip Sheridan, who is seated in the front row, second from the left. Robert is seated second from the right, and President Arthur is seated between the two. The party stopped at the Shoshone Reservation and various landmarks in Yellowstone. In 1889, he was appointed minister to the Court of St. James, today known as the Ambassador to the United Kingdom. He and his family spent 4 years in England, where Jack died and where the children snapped these photos. Upon return to the U.S., Robert continued practicing law before leading the Pullman Palace Car Company, a manufacturer of railroad cars. Robert served as legal counsel to George Pullman during the Pullman Railroad strike in 1894. 3 years later, after the death of George Pullman, Robert served as president of the company and then chairman of the board. Robert retired to his summer home, Hildene, in Manchester, Vermont. The Georgian Revival-style mansion was commissioned by Robert and built on a 412-acre property in 1905. Hildene is where he spent his days golfing, studying astronomy, and playing with his grandchildren. He was especially fond of his granddaughter Peggy, or Mary Lincoln Beckwith, who was his favorite golfing buddy, and she, within 12 years of his death, would inherit Hildene, after her Aunt Mamie, who inherited it from her mother, passed away in 1938. In the same year that Hildene was completed, in 1905, Robert wrote this letter to Arthur Hall, permitting the Lincoln National Life Insurance Company to use his father's portrait as their letterhead. Executives at Lincoln Financial Group still have reproductions of this letter on display in their offices, and we had the pleasure to show the original to the Lincoln Financial Group CEO in 2023. Robert's last public appearance was at the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., honoring his father's legacy. Robert kept tabs on the project during its creation and was said to have thought that it was the best Lincoln Memorial that had been created. Robert is pictured here with President Harding and Representative Joseph Cannon attending the dedication. While Robert was always seen as being in his father's shadow, he was far from only being his father's son. Robert experienced great personal and professional success throughout his life. He held influential positions in both the public and private sectors, married, and had a family of his own. Robert died on July 26, 1926. In death, as in life, Robert was most famous as the son of Abraham. Newspapers across the world noted his death, but most ran with the headline, "Lincoln's son dead, son of emancipator dies," or "Last son of Lincoln dies." Very few recognized him as Lincoln rather than son of Lincoln, even after a long career in politics, diplomacy, law, and business. Robert lived 83 years, including 61 years after his father's death, but he and his career remained perpetually in Abraham's shadow. Let's go ahead and circle back to the other 3 Lincoln sons. Eddie, or Edward Baker Lincoln, was the Lincoln's second son, named after his father's friend Edward Dickinson Baker, seen here in the middle. He was born on March 10, 1846, The boy was described as being of the longer order, or tall for his age. He physically resembled his father and also shared his father's love for animals. In a letter to Abraham in May 1848, Mary wrote that Robert found kittens, calling kittens your hobby. She continued, so soon as Eddie spied it, his tenderness broke forth. He made them bring it water, fed it with bread himself, with his own dear hands. He was a delighted little creature over it. The Lincolns described Eddie as a kind, tender-hearted boy, and his death, a month before his 4th birthday, devastated the family. No photos were ever taken of Eddie. In his farewell address to Springfield, Abraham Lincoln fondly stated of his hometown, "Here my children have been born, and one is buried." Eddie is buried in the family tomb at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois. Willie, or William Wallace Lincoln, was born on December 21st, 1850. He was named after his maternal uncle, Dr. William Smith Wallace. Willie and his little brother Tad were excited to live in the White House, where they owned goats, ponies, and other pets. The boys found friends to play with, mostly the children of politicians. Willie, only 10 when the family moved to the White House, was studious. Willie enjoyed writing poetry and letters to his family and friends. He loved to read and write, but cared not for his tutors. Willie was also the favorite playmate of his younger brother Tad. Throughout Willie's short life, he was described as being a bright, thoughtful, and energetic boy, the Lincoln son most like his father. The family was devastated when Willie died of typhoid in 1862. Mary kept a piece of Willie's hair, a common Victorian practice, and his funeral sermon was given by Dr. Reverend Bruley on February 24th, 1862. Tad, or Thomas Lincoln, was the youngest of the 4 Lincoln children, born on April 4th, 1853, and named after his paternal grandfather. At birth, Tad's head was unusually large. Abraham noticed the contrast between Tad's large head and little wiggling body and thought he resembled a tadpole. The nickname stuck for the rest of Tad's life. Tad was reported to be imaginative, sensitive, loving, and overly emotional, the son most like Mary. Moving into the White House when Tad was just 7, the family's new home became a playground for the rambunctious boy. Tad, like many children during the Civil War, became enthralled by the happenings around him. Tad would dress as a soldier and put on war tribunals in the White House for his zouave doll Jack. Jack later received a full presidential pardon from Abraham in the middle of a cabinet meeting. Tad and his father were very close, and Abraham indulged his son. In this note to the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, he wrote, "Let Master Tad have a Navy sword." And so Tad received a real one. Slightly the troublemaker, Tad and his brother Willie were often playmates, getting into all sorts of mischief. And Lincoln would refer to the boys as his dear rascals, while his old law partner, William Herndon, called them notorious hellions. They enjoyed playing pranks in their new home. Tad sprayed dignitaries with hoses, broke mirrors, ran into cabinet meetings, and drilled White House staff as one would drill soldiers. One story from Julia Taft's writing, she was the older sister to the Lincoln boys' playmates, was that there was a concern about Washington being invaded. The boys weren't scared, though, because they had created a fort on the roof of the White House. Julia went to see this imposing fort. The boys proudly used a log as a cannon and old guns that no longer worked to defend their home. Needless to say, Julia was left a little underwhelmed. Abraham found his son's behavior rather funny, and he was rarely seen disciplining the boys. After Willie's death, Mary Lincoln prevented children from coming to play at the White House because it caused her too much pain to hear children laughing and playing. Tad found comfort in his toys, like his wooden soldiers shown here. He paired these with a toy similar to this Mariopticon, a navy blue cardboard theater box. It contains a scroll of 22 panorama illustrations depicting scenes from the Civil War, used to act out battles. After having stayed at her husband's bedside throughout the night of April 14th, 1865, and into the following day, Mary Lincoln said goodbye to her husband for the last time at 7 a.m. She returned to the White House later that fateful day, and upon seeing her, Tad wrapped his arms around her and was reported to have said, "Don't cry so, Mama. Don't cry, or you will make me cry too. You will break my heart." The nation mourned for the family after the president's assassination, and the song, Little Tad, reflected the boy's grief. Tad, Mary, and Robert then lived together in Chicago, but upon Robert's marriage, Mary and Tad departed for Europe to escape the rather harsh press in the States. reporters were very unkind to Mary. Tad attended school in Frankfurt, Germany, where the photo on the right was taken. When Tad turned 18, he returned to Chicago with his mother, excited to meet his new niece Mamie. But he managed to get a cold that turned into something much more serious, potentially pneumonia or congestive heart failure. Tad died on July 15th, 1871, at the age of 18. That next year, drowning in intense grief, having by this point lost her parents, brothers on both sides of the war, three of her children, and witnessed her husband fatally shot at her side, Mary embarked on something of a spiritualist pilgrimage. Spiritualism being the popular 19th century belief that one could see beyond the veil of death to communicate with lost loved ones. Mary was known to have seances in the White House, at least four of which we know Abraham attended, more in an effort to make sure that Mary wasn't fooled by fraudsters. Like the one seen earlier when we talked about her insanity trial, these photos depict Mary in mourning dress. However, on this 1872 pilgrimage across the country from Chicago to Boston, Mary stopped to see mediums and eventually ended up in the studio of the country's most famous spirit photographer and had this next photo taken. Now, if you look at her shoulders and move your eyes up, you should be able to see the ghost of Abraham Lincoln. This photo gave Mary great comfort, with it showing her husband looking over her even in death. It was the last photo ever taken of her, though she lived for another decade. It was mass-produced by the photographer William Mumler, but there are only a handful of remaining copies today. Ours is not Mary's copy. We believe Robert, who was greatly embarrassed by it, burned the photo along with other family documents after Mary's death, but we can't be sure. How Mumler pulled it off is a mystery, though. Spirit photography could be accomplished one of two ways: by photographing on top of another photo to create a double exposure, or having someone step in quietly behind the person sitting for the photo before stepping out again. Mumler even went on trial for fraud when some of his ghosts were seen alive and well walking around New York City, but they couldn't prove how he did it, and thus the case was dismissed. Now, the photo of Lincoln's ghost is extraordinary because there are no photos of Lincoln in this exact position that Mumler could have photographed over to create the image. And his hands, they're too large, his arms are too short, and he would have been much taller than this. But conveniently and mysteriously, there was a fire in his studio just a few weeks before he passed away. It seems he didn't want anyone to discover his methods. To go back to 1865, in May of that year, Abraham was laid to rest with his son Willie at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield. In subsequent years, Eddie, Mary, and Tad would also be laid to rest in the tomb, which was redesigned and completed in 1874. You can see the reburial in progress in the left photo, while the completed tomb is on the right. Robert is buried in Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia with his son Jack and his wife Mary. The Lincoln family never sat for a photograph altogether, and following Lincoln's death, the country was clamoring for images of them. Many artists used photos of the family members to create composites of them together, like this one on the left. Another pays homage to Willie, including him on a portrait on the wall, as in on the image on the right. Lincoln is rightly remembered for his greatest accomplishments: writing the Emancipation Proclamation that freed all slaves in rebel territory, and championing the 13th Amendment, which freed all remaining slaves throughout the country. However, he was also a dedicated family man who always made time for his sons while seeing to the administration of the war. The Lincoln family story is a tragic one, but also one of love and perseverance. Now let's go ahead and pivot to look at some photos in the Lincoln family photo album. Like many middle-class women of her era, Mary Todd Lincoln kept a photograph album. The introduction of small, inexpensive CDV photographs and the specially constructed albums to hold them made collecting photographs popular and affordable by 1860. And Mary collected photographs of her famous contemporaries, as well as pictures of her family and friends. Her album was passed down to Robert Todd Lincoln and his descendants, with each generation adding family photographs. The Lincoln family album collection contains more than 600 photographs collected by the four generations of the Lincoln family. First, we will take a look at photographs that are part of our online curated grouping, which you can find along with other curated groupings at lincolncollection.org. After this, we will take a look at some photos that didn't make it into that curated group. As mentioned, the Lincolns never had a family photograph taken, and we saw this composite before. After Abraham Lincoln's assassination, this composite of the family is a photograph of an engraving based on a painting, which itself was based on separate photographs of Robert, Abraham and Tad, and Mary. Willie Lincoln, who died in 1862, is shown in the portrait on the wall. The rest of the family is focused on a book and Lincoln's lap. Robert was never photographed in uniform, though, having only served in the last 4 months of the war. So Carpenter, the artist, took a photo of another soldier, cropped out his head, and pasted Robert's on top. This family image quickly became one of the most popular Lincoln pictures and is one of my personal favorites because it pays homage to Willie and speaks to the country relating to the Lincoln family's grief, with much of the population having lost loved ones during the war years as well. This photograph of a beardless Lincoln was taken on August 13th, 1860 by Preston Butler in Springfield, Illinois, 3 months before the presidential election. Lincoln would not grow his beard until after the election, which he did at the suggestion of a little girl, Grace Fidel, aged 11, who wrote to him during the campaign season saying, essentially, if only you'd grow some whiskers, the women would tease their husbands to vote for you. And oh, by the way, do you have any daughters? Tell them I said hello. Lincoln wrote back and later met her in person when his inauguration train stopped in Westfield, New York. On January 8, 1864, Lincoln sat for several portraits at Matthew Brady's Washington studio. This one, in which Lincoln appears dignified and at ease, is included in the family album. Still dressed in mourning following the death of Willie Lincoln and the previous year, Mary Lincoln had this portrait taken at the studio of E. and H.T. Anthony in Washington, D.C. Many years later, Robert Lincoln apparently lent the photograph to someone, perhaps a publisher, and wrote on the back, "Return to the Honorable R.T. Lincoln." The Lincoln's oldest son, Robert, was a student at Harvard University for most of his father's presidency and spent little time at the White House. But the 17-year-old took time while in Washington in May 1861 to pose for this photograph at Matthew Brady's studio. Shortly after the family moved to the White House, Willie had his picture taken at Matthew Brady's Washington studio. The 10-year-old struck a debonair pose with hat and cane. This photograph is the last one of Willie included in the family album, due to his death in February 1862. This one is another favorite. Youngest son Tad was fascinated by the soldiers he saw in Washington. He was photographed in his own Zouave uniform, rifle in hand. The 8-year-old boy then made himself look more grown up by inking in eyebrows, mustache, goatee, and sword belt. After Abraham Lincoln's assassination, Mary, Robert, and Tad moved to Chicago, where Samuel S. Fassett took this photograph of Tad at age 12. This photo was taken 3 years before Tad and Mary sailed for Europe, and 6 years before Tad sadly passed away. In 1868, Robert was an attorney practicing law in Chicago. This photograph of the mustachioed 25-year-old lawyer was taken there by John Carbett. On September 24, 1868, Robert Lincoln married Mary Harlan of Mount Pleasant, Iowa. This undated portrait of Mary, which shows signs of having been displayed in an oval frame, became part of the Lincoln family's photo collection. Robert and Mary Lincoln had 3 children: Mamie, who was born in 1869, Jack, born in 1873, and Jesse, born in 1875. Mary Todd Lincoln received a baby picture of each grandchild with a note from the proud parents on the back. On Mamie's picture was written, "Miss Lincoln's compliments to Grandma, June 8, 1870. On Jack's, Mr. Lincoln, aged 3 months, on November 14, 1873. And on Jesse's, number 3 Lincoln, July 6, 1876. In this informal photograph taken at home, Father Robert studies toddler Jack as he intently examines something in his hands. Taken by Chicago photographer Max Platz, this cabinet card photograph shows the 3 Lincoln grandchildren shortly before their family moved to London, where Robert would serve as the U.S. Minister to the Court of St. James during the Harrison administration. This photograph is one of several Kodak snapshots taken by Robert's children while they lived in London. Here, 16-year-old Jack sits in his bed during his last illness. 21-year-old Mamie Lincoln married Charles Isham on September 2, 1891, in the Church of the Holy Trinity near London. In her wedding portrait, taken by J. Thompson, photographer to the Queen, she wears a dress of white satin with a long train trimmed with orange blossoms and lace veil. Jesse Lincoln wears fashionable Lego mutton sleeves and an elaborately ornate hat in this portrait by an unknown photographer. In 1897, Jesse scandalized her family by eloping with Warren Beckwith, a star of the Iowa Wesleyan College football team and minor league baseball player. Mamie and Charles Isham had one son, Lincoln Isham, born in 1892. Lincoln and his mother posed together in this photograph. The photograph is undated, but Lincoln, as tall as his mother, appears to be a teenager. Jesse and Warren Beckwith had two children before they divorced in 1907. Peggy, or Mary Lincoln Beckwith, was born in 1898, and Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith was born in 1904. In this photograph, 14-year-old Peggy and 8-year-old Bob pose with their mother. Peggy and Bob, who died in 1975 and 1985 respectively, were the last direct descendants of Abraham and Mary. On April 30th, 1913, Robert Todd Lincoln inscribed this photograph to his granddaughter Peggy. He wrote, "To Mary Lincoln Beckwith from her affectionate grandfather, R.T. Lincoln." At that time, Robert was chairman of the board of the Pullman Company. On May 30th, 1922, 78-year-old Robert Todd Lincoln attended the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Although he requested that no special notice be taken of him at that ceremony, he was seated on the speaker's platform with other dignitaries. In this photograph, Robert stands between President Harding on the left and Representative Cannon on the right. The Lincoln Memorial dedication ceremony was Robert's final public appearance. He died 4 years later at the age of 82. Now we're going to go ahead and transition over to other photographs that didn't make it into the curated grouping. These photos can be found on Content DM under the Lincoln Family Album. The Lincoln Family Albums, starting with Abraham and going down the family line to Peggy Lincoln Beckwith, had a love for animals. Here we can see some examples of animals loved by the Lincoln family. In the first picture, we have Fido, Abraham Lincoln's dog that didn't make the move to the White House. The second photo shows Abraham's horse, Old Bob, who also didn't make the move to the White House, but was brought out for Lincoln's funeral. In this photo, he is held by Reverend Henry Brown, who had been a conductor on the Underground Railroad. The last photograph is of Peggy with her dog. Unfortunately, I don't know the name of her dog. These two pictures are a fun comparison of Tad Lincoln on a pony when he was 10 years old and his nephew, Jack Lincoln, at the age of 13. The family's album also included images of extended family, such as Tad and Willie with their cousin Lockwood Todd. This photo was taken at Matthew Brady's studio in 1861. The Lincolns also collected photographs of Abraham's political allies, such as this photograph of David Davis. Davis was part of the team of people that helped to get Abraham nominated as the Republican candidate for president in 1860. He would go on to be the executor of Lincoln's estate after his assassination, and someone Robert Todd Lincoln would turn to in difficult times. The Lincolns collected images of political opponents as well as the allies. Here we see Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln's political rival since his Springfield days. Lincoln and Douglas went head-to-head during the 1858 race for the Senate. The debates these two men engaged in would be remembered as the Lincoln-Douglas debates that would bring Lincoln's name to a national audience. They would go against each other again during the 1860 presidential election. Douglas would go on to support Lincoln's efforts to keep the Union together. The other man here is George V. McClellan. Lincoln promoted McClellan to the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Unfortunately, McClellan was consistently hesitant to engage with and pursue rebels. He would be fired twice by Lincoln, and in 1864, he would run against Lincoln for president. They also collected photos of prominent generals and soldiers they had personal connections to. General Ulysses S. Grant was promoted to commanding general of the Union armies in 1864. Lincoln had finally found a general he could trust in Grant. General William T. Sherman's efforts in Georgia in 1864 directly assisted to the re-election of Lincoln. His efforts at Atlanta were the major win Lincoln needed to raise morale in the North. Finally, here we see Elmer E. Ellsworth. Ellsworth was the first official casualty of the war. He was shot after removing a Confederate flag flying over a business in Alexandria, Virginia, basically in the White House's backyard. Ellsworth was also a close personal friend to the Lincoln family. He had moved to Springfield to work in Lincoln's law office and followed him to Washington. The Lincolns also collected photographs of, as Lincoln called them, so-called Confederates. Here we see Confederate President Jefferson Davis. The family collected 3 photos of Davis and 4 political cartoons of him as well. This photograph depicts Davis's capture by Union troops on May 10, 1865. He is depicted in women's clothing because he tried to disguise himself wearing a large cloak and shawl, which from a distance looked like women's clothing. The family also collected photographs of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. They collected 4 photos of the leading rebel general. The family did collect images of Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, as well, including this one, depicting Booth about to enter Lincoln's theater box, holding a dagger and a gun, with a devil pointing him in the right direction. In total, the family collected 6 photographs of Booth. They also collected images of Lincoln in his deathbed. This one depicts Mary kneeling at his bedside. The family didn't just collect images of important people to them, but also important places, including these 3 places where the Lincolns lived together. The first is the Springfield house, which is the only house Abraham bought, and the home where their second son Eddie was born and passed away. They also lived in the White House, where Abraham was president and where their third son Willie passed away. The family would also spend a lot of time, especially during the summer, at the old soldiers' home. The soldiers' home was a military asylum where wounded and disabled soldiers could stay. It also became a presidential retreat. Other important buildings in Washington that the family kept photos of were the Capitol Building, the U.S. Department of War, now the Department of Defense, located in the Pentagon, and the Smithsonian Institute. The Capitol Building would be significant to the family as Lincoln served in Congress from 1847 to 1849. The Department of War would have been significant to the Lincolns because of the Civil War, since Abraham was constantly in and out of the building waiting for news from the front. This is also the building where it's reported that Secretary of War Edwin Stanton made Tad a lieutenant, a station Tad leveraged to discharge White House guards and put servants in their place. While his father found it amusing, his brother Robert decidedly did not, and complained to Lincoln's personal secretary, John Nicolay. The Lincolns also collected images of important and famous people of their time. Here we have Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales. During Lincoln's time in the White House, this is how he was known. In 1901, he would take the throne of the United Kingdom as King Edward VII. While Abraham never met Edward, his son Robert would have during his time as minister to the court of St. James, shortly before the prince became king. They also collected a photo of Napoleon III, ruler of the Second French Empire, not to be confused with his uncle, Napoleon Bonaparte. During the American Civil War, Napoleon III here was trying to take over Mexico. Secretary of State William Seward issued statements of disapproval, but otherwise tried to keep relations with France neutral while the U.S. was embroiled in its own war. The Lincolns collected a couple of photographs of George Washington. Abraham himself held a reverence for the first president. Both are some of the most written about presidents, with Lincoln himself being the most written about United States president. The family also collected images of famous writers of their time. Here we have Victor Hugo, who some might know as having authored The Hunchback of Notre Dame, probably most notably known by its cartoon rendition by Disney, and Les Mis. Thank you all so much for joining us today to take a look at the Lincoln family photo album and to learn a little bit more about the Lincoln family. If you would like to learn more, you can check out our curated groupings at lincolncollection.org. If you have any questions right now, though, we're going to go ahead and pop those into the Q&A.
It says President Lincoln and Mary visited General Grant at City Point in Hopewell, Virginia, just outside of Richmond. The visit took place weeks before the South surrendered. Are there any records of Lincoln's observations of City Point while he was there, or are there any photos?
Were there any photos? I think there are photos of Lincoln at City Point, but I don't think that we have any in the collection here. And as far as records of his observations of City Point while he was there, I'm not quite sure on that one. If we do go ahead and email us, though, we can definitely look that up and give you a better answer for that one.
So here's another question. Why is the Lincoln collection titled Financial?
Oh, okay. So the Lincoln Collection, this collection that we work with here at the Allen County Public Library was originally started by the Lincoln Financial Group. It was started way back in the early 1900s. They even asked Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham's son, if they could use the Lincoln name and his portrait for their letterhead. And so when they decided that they no longer wanted to have a museum here in Fort Wayne, they donated it to the state of Indiana, and it was titled the Lincoln Financial Foundation Collection as a homage to them.
What is the earliest known photo of Abraham Lincoln?
So the earliest known photo comes from 1840, I want to say seven. He had just gotten elected. He had just heard that he had gotten elected to Congress, and he immediately ran down and got a photograph taken of him. So that's the earliest known one, and I think it's 47, but don't quote me.
There's a question. Are you aware of a photo of Tad with his father with Abe wearing glasses? I see there's a photo like this, but Tad is on the wrong side of his father.
So the photograph that we normally see of little Tad looking over his father's shoulder, they're actually, I think, looking at a photograph album. It's used quite a bit, and people do flip it around. And I think he is wearing glasses in that photograph. I think during my presentation we saw a couple renditions of that. It was often cut out, and sometimes it was even used to mistakenly say that Tad was Willie, and then they'd make a smaller kid in the composites to be Tad. Um, but as far as is Abe wearing glasses, he is wearing glasses in that photograph.
Are there any info pictures on the Hanks family? I have a family named Flowers in New Jersey with a connection to Lincoln.
Do we have any info or pictures of the Hanks family? I'm not, I don't know that we do have any. I definitely have information on the Hanks family. We definitely have genealogy information as well. I don't know if we have any photographs of the Hanks. I'd have to look that up. But if you email that question, and if you have a name that we might be able to look through our files, we can definitely get back to you on that one.
Oh, someone is, they put in a side note about the City Point. They said that they
Mm.
used to live in Richmond, Virginia, and that there's photos of Lincoln, perhaps at the Virginia Historical Museum.
Okay, yeah. I definitely knew there are photos. I just don't think any in our collection, Lincoln Financial Foundation collection, that we have any photos of Abe and City.
Well, it looks like we flew through those questions pretty quickly. Um, oh, so Lincoln was 18 years of age when his father remarried.
No, Lincoln was quite a bit younger. He was 18 when his older sister Sarah passed away. Lincoln was, I want to say, around 9 or 10. I don't have that number exactly off the top of my head. I could look it up. But yeah, he was quite a bit younger. His mother died in 1818, and then the following year in 1819 is when Thomas got remarried.
Do you have newspaper articles?
Do we have newspaper articles? What do we mean by that?
Do you have
Like
actual
just
newspapers in the
newspapers
collection?
in the collection? Yes, we do. A lot of those can actually be found on Internet Archive. So we can put links and stuff to that. And if you go to either one, if you go to the Allen County Public Library and you look up items from our collection there, it should take you out. And then if you look at lincolncollection.org for newspapers, we'll definitely take you to Internet Archive.
One more question. Did he leave home when he turned 21?
When he turned 21, he left home in 1831. I think he was 20 when he left home.
Okay.
Because the family moved in 1830 to move to Illinois, and he was an adult when he moved with them. And then he moved out the year later.
Well, thank you so much.
Sure.
We flew through those questions pretty quickly. If anybody has questions, we've been putting the email in there. So Lincoln at acpl.info. So make sure to shoot an email to our Lincoln librarians if you have any further questions. But thank you so much, Abbie, for an incredibly interesting presentation. And people are incredibly happy in the chat. So thank you.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
have a good rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.